Like a backstage pass to the world of fly fishing travel, this is Waypoints, the podcast of destination angling. News and events, helpful travel tips, destination profiles, great stories, and expert advice from some of the most seasoned and experienced names in fishing travel. Waypoints is brought to you by Yellow Dog Fly Fishing Adventures, the industry's #1 specialty travel company for the very best insider knowledge, logistical support, and trip preparation. Freshwater or saltwater, international or domestic, Yellow Dog has you covered for your next fishing adventure. And now, your Waypoints host, Yellow Dog founder and director, Jim Klug.
UMPQUA Feather Merchants is one of the biggest names in the fly fishing industry, a manufacturing powerhouse when it comes to flies, leader and tippet, hooks, fishing packs, accessories, and more. More than 50 years ago, the company was launched by a small group of hardcore anglers and dedicated fly tiers. And since that time, UMPQUA has had a massive impact on the way the fly fishing industry has grown and evolved. This is a company that has been at the forefront of innovation for the large-scale production and delivery of fly tackle, especially with regard to high-quality flies. While some anglers enjoy tying and creating their own flies, the vast majority of fishermen still purchase commercially tied fly patterns through their local fly fishing retailer or through a favorite website. But when we grab a handful of patterns from the fly bins of a shop, most of us are unaware of where exactly these flies come from, giving little thought to how they were designed, produced, tied, shipped, and supplied. So much goes into the actual creation and production of quality, effective fly patterns, and the actual process is rarely thought about by the average angler. Which is why my guest today is Russ Miller, Director of Marketing for UMPQUA Feather Merchants. Russ, welcome to Waypoints, and thanks for joining us here in the studio.
Jim, great to be here. I appreciate you having me on.
Well, I think this is, if it's not our 50th episode, it's close to it, and we've actually relocated the recording here to our new studios located at the Yellow Dog Fly Shop. So we're excited to be official and down here in the studio, and you're a great first guest to launch this new location.
Happy to help break it in.
Well, Russ, tell us a little bit about your current position at UMPQUA and give us a little background on kind of your journey in the sport of fly fishing and the industry.
Yeah, I've been with UMPQUA for just shy of 5 years in their marketing position. Kind of a newly created role. I always say we're a 50-year-old company with about a 10-year-old brand. We're, the milk and eggs, the bulk granola of a lot of fly shops. And so we've had a lot of challenges in trying to build our brand and make us a little bit more household. If you tie flies, you recognize our name on packages of hooks and stuff like that. But the general customer just sees flies in the bin, and the fly shops really kind of understand the UMPQUA brand. And so we've been really trying to get our name out there, leverage our signature tires, and do some really fun, different ways of reaching people that hadn't been done before.
And prior to your time at UMPQUA, how did you first find your way to the fly fishing industry, and what was kind of that road?
Dedication and stupidity. My grandfather was a big fisherman. We spent a lot of time fishing the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and I grew up in the Chicagoland area. So conventional world, and it was in Colorado on a family trip to Steamboat. I got my first fly rod and caught rainbow trout out of the Yampa and fried them up in a cast iron pan on the banks, which was awesome, and brought the rod home and caught panfish and smallmouth and stuff like that, and moved out to CU Boulder for college. And I was the kid that came to the fly shop 4 days a week. It was on my way home, and finally they were like, you could work here a little bit and make some money if you wanted. And I was like, I don't know if I'm actually ready for that. I just like fishing. And so they finally wore me down, and I started to do some walkway trips, which felt like good money for a college kid. And I thought I had no place doing it. And I was like, I'm trying to figure it all out for myself. And but yeah, really intro into that. And then once I graduated CU, I did the ski bum, trout bum thing and worked at a pizza place. And I thought I was living my best life. And then I started to have to pay student loans, and I was like, this is expensive to live in Boulder. And so I started to run an e-commerce site for Front Range Anglers. They hired me on to rebrand their site and do all of that, which was awesome. And it was really blew open the doors. So that was really how I got into it. And then from there, we moved to Seattle, and I worked for Farbank, Sage, Rio, and Redington, and got into their marketing world there. Tag Kleiner over there, who still runs their marketing, kind of was like, I think you might be better in marketing than sales. And I'm really thankful that he said that, because I couldn't agree more. I'm not really a hardcore sales guy. I love celebrating our sport, telling stories about the different people and places that the fly fishing takes us. And my wife was out there for school. That's what originally took us to Seattle area. And after we had our first child there, and after she got some residency offers in the Puget Sound area, she's like, I'm done with the rain. I cannot do another day of this. We're moving. And so we looked at maybe moving to Helena, and then Colorado. And we had family there, and I was like, Colorado's not half bad. And by the time we moved back, I was like, Colorado's very different than when we went to school here. A lot busier. I got a job working for Fish Pond, and so worked with them, and I did that for almost 2 years, and then came over to UMPQUA. So I've kind of seen, I always say it's like the Goldilocks scenario for me. I saw a really big company on the manufacturing side. I saw a really small family-run business, and UMPQUA's kind of this Goldilocks right in the middle. We're about 40 employees at our office, and it's really run as a family business, which is super cool.
I like the temperature's just right.
Just right.
Well, today, UMPQUA, as you said earlier, anyone who works in the industry, anyone who owns a fly shop, anyone who does purchasing, UMPQUA is a major player. But to the consumer, that's kind of been a recent emergence for the company as far as brand awareness. But it is nonetheless a big, big player in fly fishing. 50-year anniversary. Talk to us a little bit about the early years. How did UMPQUA start, and what were those, kind of those pioneering days like for UMPQUA?
Oh, man. So we had our 50th catalog that came out 2 years ago. And that was an incredibly fun project for me, because I got to call up all of these old timers and ask them, because I don't think it's fair to write the history from our perspective today. So I called the people and I said, hey, help me write your perspective of it. And it was kind of interesting, because after 50 years, people's stories change, and you hear this portion from this person, and oh, no, he's got that all wrong. This is the way it really happened. But I think at the end of it, what I got out of that was that these people, the founders, Dennis and really Randall, they loved fly fishing. They loved fly tying. And this was a way that they could see the world doing it all. And so they started this thing, and against all odds, it shouldn't have happened. It is a ridiculously homegrown story with a lot of failures, a lot of dead ends, and yet it happened. And I think that was the coolest. The part of that was really getting to dive into that and hear it from these people. And everything from, when fluorocarbon first entered into fly fishing, Orvis and UMPQUA got it, and the story of how those two brands got it is absolutely ridiculous. The same person really brought it to both companies and literally did the bait and switch on his name tag at a show. He's like, I have Orvis, I got to do this real quick, and then pulls out his UMPQUA badge and puts that out. We also need it over here. Absolutely ridiculous.
Well, Dennis Black, he's kind of the founder of UMPQUA. Back in 1972. He officially started the company. And when it came to flies at the time, I think a lot of anglers today, 50 plus years later, don't realize that in the 50s, 60s, 70s, almost all of the fly shops in the U.S. sold flies that were tied and sourced in the U.S. And these were oftentimes patterns supplied by either small kind of boutique tying companies, or, as was often the case, they were tied by local guides or shop employees or even the shop owners. And I think at the time, a lot of retailers believed that true high-quality fishing flies had to be tied locally. They had to be U.S.-based, oftentimes in their own backyard, if they were going to be any good. And if you were bringing in flies from overseas destinations like Asia, they might not be of the same quality. But at the same time, the trouble was the sport was growing and was growing in popularity, and there was more and more demand for flies, and that kind of cottage industry boutique, production couldn't keep up with the demand. And so all of a sudden there was this need to source larger volumes of flies, and Dennis was really the one that kind of pioneered putting those pieces together and delivering quality flies.
Yeah, I think everyone I talked to in those interviews referred to him kind of as a visionary. Like, he had this vision of what it could be, and he saw that limitation, like you alluded to. Like, you couldn't get enough. By the time it was peak season, your bins were empty and you're knocking on the door of the guy that had tied the flies for you all winter long. He's like, I need more. He's like, dude, I'm fishing. Like,
Yeah.
and
I'm guiding, I'm fishing, I'm not tying in the summer.
I'm not going to tie, 24 hours a day. We're going to work all day and then tie all night. And so Dennis really saw that, and he knew that the quality issue was going to be the biggest thing to overcome. And, these flies were known to unravel in the air as you're casting them practically, right? Like that's the level of quality we're talking about compared to something that someone's going to high grade every feather on, and really take their time. And so what he did to overcome that is he said, cool, well, I'm going to go. He had been, the reason we got our name, the UMPQUA Feather Merchants, he had been going over to India to source feather. Feather was really hard to get. And that's where our name came. The feather merchant. He was really out of Oregon. There was another feather merchant out of Northern California. And so he had migrated up to the banks of North Umpqua. And so he was the feather merchant selling out of the valley. That's really how he got his start. That's really how he got into a lot of fly shops. And he said, well, cool. I'm going to take these high quality feathers and I'm going to go live in India. These are people that are craft people, work with their hands. And so he went in there and said, let's set up shop. I'm going to teach you to tie flies like I tie flies. And Dennis was known as a really great fly tyer. And so he lived over there for almost 2 years, trained factories. And he said, cool, I've got something now. And so he brought that back to the States in 1971, met up with Dave Whitlock at the Federation of Flycasters and said, Dave, we'd like to put your name on flies and sell them. And Dave's like, there's no chance. And Dennis had tied up a couple of his flies and he said, well, put one in here. Shook his hands up, showed it to Dave. He's like, well, which one's yours? And Dave was like, I'll sign up. Kind of proof in the pudding on some of that stuff, right?
That's amazing. And I mean, it wasn't enough to just scour the world for factories that were producing. At that point, you had to go over and start the factories. You had to teach every one of these people how to tie these patterns and then raise that bar of quality and consistency, which had never been done before.
And overcome that, I talked to Mike Lawson, and Mike was just like, when this guy came to town, he was like, I really thought there was no chance I was going to be interested in doing anything overseas. And Mike, commercial fly tyer himself to fill his bins, he was like, look, Dennis, if you can get me flies that look like mine and fill my bins, I'll do it. And so Mike was our second signature tyer, just because Mike didn't want to be tying all of the flies all the time for his bins. And he saw the need on the Henry's Fork because that had blown up into the U.S. destination for great trout fishing.
Yeah, and empty bins at this time were plaguing people. So what, at the time, he's dealing with all these different levels, the quality control, the ability to bring them into the country, still training new tyers, expanding operations overseas. I mean, there's a lot of moving pieces. Fast forward a few years where these factories are now established. Give us kind of an overview of what a commercial fly tying operation, whether it's in Thailand or India or any of these other, kind of far off destinations, how does it work? It's a complicated process, but give us the basics of how a production facility and a commercial tying operation overseas works.
Yeah. Well, so UMPQUA has 5 factories, and we're exclusive at all 5. Of those 5 factories, we own 3 of them. So the way it looks and the way they operate for a lot of them are really up to us. Daniel Eisenminger, who's been with UMPQUA since we moved locations to Louisville, Colorado, went over and lived in Thailand for 2 years to set up our Thai factory and Laos factory. And then our factory out of Sri Lanka has been a partner for 40 years. So they run really nice. Our average length of service at all of those factories is 25 years for a fly tyer. So you start to really, these are women, all exclusively women that tie flies. The patience, the quality is significantly better than men. And so you really get unbelievable quality with that. You get great quality of life. So the way we do payment on this is you get base pay. And then you get bonus for quantity above that. So in a day, you should be able to tie X number of flies. And that number varies based on complexity of the fly. And then if you can tie above that, then there's real bonus incentives once you get there. And so a lot of the women out-earn the men at a lot of our factories because they have been doing it so long. They're so good at it. And it's really changed the culture around these factories, which is really cool, of the local, way that, women have not been kind of the main breadwinner. And what's really cool, Daniel told me this on the last one, we're expanding our Laos factory. And he said that a lot of the women have sent their children to college that have now begun tying at the factories too. So that's like passing on to that next generation, which is super cool.
And of these factories, whether it's Sri Lanka or Thailand or Laos, how large are these factories? How kind of on average, how many people might they employ?
Yeah, it depends. It depends, but we employ a good number of tires. It's not, 4 ladies sitting around a desk with a pile of feathers in the middle. There are job captains. There are managers of the factory. There's bulk departments, and that's really how tires get started, is sorting bulk materials and building jobs, as we call them. And so you'll grade enough feathers for enough flies, and then that gets put down onto a table. And then, we have different departments. And so there are saltwater tires. There are freshwater tires, there are dry fly tires, there are nymph tires. And again, the idea with that structure we've got is you'll have someone that'll tie saltwater flies for, exclusively for 15 or 20 years, because they can get really good and fast at them. You don't have that diversity where someone can I want you to tie this. They can tie anything. They're really good at tying specific flies because they can get really fast at them.
Well, and I've heard stories about how, in like Chiang Mai, Thailand, where there's several tying factories, it's like a coveted, position player in sports. It's like, well, this is the, the Royal
Absolutely.
Wolf lady, or
Absolutely.
maybe she and her team, like they do it better than anyone, and they're really coveted by the factories. And you want to score that position player in so many words.
So that would be Chandra at one of our factories, and she got into a little tying competition with Charlie Craven, one of our tires, and there was a video that we took, and she tied a copper john in, it was like a minute 10, start to finish. Bead was on the hook, and hook was in the jaws. And Charlie was like, dude, I think I can beat her. And so he spent about 3 months getting his speed up. And you can do it in a minute 10, and it looks like the copper john that you have in your bins. Like it's perfect. And so he spent 3 months doing it, and he was like, man, I beat her time. I'm down to just over a minute. It's like a minute 3 or something like that. And, Jeff's like chuckles at him. And he's like, well, I hate to tell you, Charlie, but, she's been working 5 days a week for 8 hours a day, still tying flies. Well, you've been ringing registers and stuff like that. I was like, I guarantee you she's faster. He's like, I'm tapping out. No way. I don't care to try anymore. So, yeah, there are real powerhouse tires at some of these factories. And,
I mean, they're all overseas now. Are there any large-scale commercial operations left in the U.S., or are they all foreign-based now?
Not that I'm aware of. There's a lot of hand-tied flies out there, a lot of Etsy tires, a lot of tires that still put flies in bins that are unique to regions and stuff like that. And I think that makes up a legitimate amount of flies at the end of the day domestically, but it's not one company doing that, right? It's
not a factory operation.
Correct. It's a real crowdsourced deal.
So how long will it take? You're talking about Chandra, some of these specific tires, and they kind of own their patterns. They get really good at whether it's saltwater, freshwater. For a freshwater fly, let's say a trout fly, let's say a stonefly nymph, how long will it take an experienced tyer to tie one of these patterns?
Well, like I said, you can do a copper john in about a minute 10, which is kind of bonkers to think about. It looks like it's in, we're used to it now. This was like old days. This would have been on like a VHS tape practically. But like, now you would think someone was like 2X on their phone. They're moving so fast. And
they're tying 3 or 4 dozen an hour.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah.
And complex patterns change that, right? But like, it's jaw-dropping to me. And one of our fly guys, so we typically have someone that really spends a lot of time at UMPQUA managing quality and working with our factories on materials and all that stuff. And they go over to the factories, and typically they're great fly tires themselves, so they can communicate appropriately. And they go over to the factories, and the factories are teaching them things. And they're like, oh, this is actually how we're a little bit more efficient. Watch, we can double this up and twice. And you're like, whoa, like you guys are even like innovating yourselves without changing the pattern at all. Like it's really cool.
Well, and you get somebody that's been doing it, as you said a moment ago, for like 20, 25 years, they learn a thing or two about production tying.
And I think that's always the hardest thing is the difference truly between production tying and like production tying, even, you know, some of those domestic tires, right? Like a bag is in front of you and that is your 40 dozen. And so shoot through the bag. You can do it in a day. Probably not the case, but if you can do it in a week, you know, that was your week was 40 dozen of the same fly, and everything's perfectly graded and sorted for you and ready to go.
What do you think some of the common misconceptions, either inside the fly fishing industry or outside, are about these international tying factories and operations? I mean, the numbers you just threw out and the like the tenure of a lot of these tires. I mean, this is an economic driver in a lot of these communities, and probably changing some lives, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're really proud of that. Like we have photos of our factory up on our website. They're probably buried a little bit more than we should have them, but you know, they're beautifully well lit factories. A lot of smiling faces from all the women. We did a little photo shoot over there, unfortunately during COVID, so they're all masked up, but yeah, it's a pretty special thing, like to watch that happen. And yeah.
Changing lives.
Yeah. It really, the story of Daniel telling me that, you know, the generational stuff to me is pretty cool. He goes over a couple times a year typically and spends time with the factories, sorts out any kind of issues we're having. The other nice thing about our exclusive factories is it allows us to really control the workflow, right? So in years where rebuilding inventory post-COVID is essential, that's huge. And you know, they're hand-tied flies. I had one of your customers ask me, you know, when we were outside the shop the other day, he's like, well, how do they do all this with the machine? And I was like, you don't. You tie all these by hand. It's nuts.
So that was good. That was my next question, actually, because working at the fly shop, you get asked that multiple times a day, and people have a hard time, I think, wrapping their head around the fact that every single pattern, you know, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of patterns that fill the bins in a fly shop, every one of them was tied by hand. That's hard to wrap your mind around. And I think people just assume there must be some kind of machine process that can at least do a portion of these flies, but that's not the case.
It's all by hand. It's totally bonkers to think about getting it all done and filling bins across the country. And you know, if you ever come to our headquarters in Louisville, I always call them the matrix stacks. And I mean, like, it's like all these white shelving units, and you go in there and it looks like it goes on forever. And it's, you know, flies from, you know, 15 feet up all the way down to the ground. And you're like, this is all tied by hand. This is insane.
It's like that classic shot at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, the movie, when they wheel the Ark of the Covenant into the government warehouse and it pans up and it looks like it just goes back indefinitely, right? Like these endless corridors. That's the fly.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
That's a lot of inventory.
It's a lot of inventory. When we had that fire that came through, I mean, it got 400 yards from our back door, you know, going to bed at like 1 a.m. that night. I was like on Twitter trying to figure out where everything was going because it was an unbelievably destructive fire. And I was like, there's zero chance we could rebuild all this hand-tied inventory in any kind of timeline that would be reasonable for a dealer.
That would have been devastating.
Like soul crushing. And it was for a lot of folks.
Yeah, it was a horrific fire. The Boulder fires down there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, it's quite an operation. You mentioned a minute ago the names Dave Whitlock, Mike Lawson. One thing that UMPQUA has become known for within fly manufacturing, really from the beginning, is your signature tire program. And I want to ask you about this because you know, you guys have always, from the get-go, partnered with people like Whitlock and Lawson. I mean, Lefty Cray, Randall Kaufman, one of the saltwater pioneers, obviously, Dahlberg. I mean, so many of them. Talk to us a little bit about the role that signature tires play in UMPQUA's fly lineup, both historically and right up to today. Tell us a little bit about that signature program.
Yeah, so the signature program, I think, was the visionary portion of Dennis there. Like, how do we overcome this countrywide stigma of these awful flies that are going to come from overseas, right? And, well, Dave Whitlock's a big name. We should probably put his name next to the pattern and say, well, this is Dave's top fly, just tied overseas. It's not tied by Dave anymore, but it's tied to his specs.
Approved by Dave.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that's a big deal. And so it started with a small group, and then you have to pay these guys because it's a small group and it's a circle of trust there. And if you violate that, I feel like it would be more detrimental in the long run. And so UMPQUA started paying. Dennis made sure to pay the royalties on time and make sure these guys were happy and their patterns looked good. And once that started to happen, people came knocking and they said, well, you guys looking for any of the, and so on these runs that they would make, and they had an old Volkswagen bus, and that was kind of the their tour guide through the country, and they'd meet new people and at different shows and sign up new tires, and the tires would sign up other new tires, right? So Whitlock is really the guy that got Dahlberg into UMPQUA, and it just kind of snowballed and took on a life of its own. And I think even the whole story of how it came to be is so cool. We're sitting across a table like this, and this is exactly how Randall and Dennis used to tie. It was across the table, but in the middle between their vices was a boombox, and the boombox used to just play the radio. And Randall one day was just like, it's kind of cool. These guys get a royalty every time the song is played, and that kind of got filed away for about 4 or 5 years. And then that same idea came back out when it was after Dennis had gone to the factories and set that all up, and we should give these guys a royalty for every time we sell one of their flies. It really came from these guys racing each other during songs, and they were like, well, how many flies do you think you can tie during, Fortunate Son here? I bet I can get through 3. And that was the way they were tying flies back then. And that motivated the whole signature program. And, now we've got, 240 folks, plus or minus. And it's really awesome because we get regional lift in the different areas. And so we've got everything from interesting Midwestern flies, destination saltwater stuff, Northeast. I mean, it's a pretty broad, wide catalog. And again, from a marketing perspective, it's super cool to be able to tap into these guys and the local knowledge. Well, why'd you do that? Well, in our fisheries, we do da-da-da-da-da.
It's amazing. And for these fly tires, I think a lot of people didn't understand the royalties portion of it, but legitimate fly tires, let's take John Barr, for example, innovator, inventor of the Copper John, right? So he comes, UMPQUA looks at the Copper John and says, yeah, we think we're going to sell a pile of these, right? So you put them into production. Every shop, especially in the Western U.S., got to have Copper Johns. Becomes one of the hot flies, really, for decades. And John gets a commission on every one of those that is tied and sold through UMPQUA. That's how the signature program works.
And he still gets that.
Yeah, to this day.
And we have tires that have passed, and their wives get that royalty check still. So we continue. It's for life, which is cool.
I think a lot of people don't realize that. That is pretty interesting.
Yeah, and some of these are beer money, some of these are decent part-time jobs, and some of these guys are getting paid pretty good. I
was just about to ask that. I mean, there's probably a wide range of what a royalty situation can generate, but I mean, there are some all-star flies out there that have become absolute staples in any fly fisherman's box, right? And those guys are probably doing pretty well off this program.
I always think so. I look at that. I was like, I should get some flies in the UMPQUA catalog. Because it's interesting. It builds momentum, right? And the more you get your name out there, I think John Barr's a perfect guy. He's Colorado local. He's got up the gut patterns. They're not overly showy, but they are crazy fishy. He only fishes his flies, which I think is really interesting. So you look at his boxes and it's his John Barr flies, which is cool. And they just continue to build. And the next John Barr fly that comes out, you're like, well, I should probably give it a try. All of his other ones were winners. And so as you move up the ladder, it's just easier to get that momentum. It's getting it started. And that's where being associated with a good shop, or your local community. So those flies are a part of that, being a kind of a promoter of yourself. And some of those flies are just the Copper John really took on a life of its own. It was one of the first big runaways. Blaine's Gummy Minnow was one of the big runaways too. That was we just did that many gummy minnows. Oh my goodness, I didn't think that was possible.
And you guys have done a great job really kind of ushering in the next generation. I mean, you've got the Whitlocks, the Crays, the Dahlbergs, but then you've got Alec Gerbeck, Doug McKnight, a lot of these younger tyers that, you've discovered their skills and their talents of creating these super effective, fish catching patterns. You bring them into the stable and it helps build them up within the industry. And not only are you, kind of ushering in the next generation, but you're ensuring that you're selling the most cutting edge, effective patterns that, the guys out on the front lines are innovating with. They're catching fish and they're doing it oftentimes in new destinations and exotic destinations, which really has such a tie into the travel segment and to traveling, to chase big exotic fish all over the place. So it's pretty cool that they also are invited to have a seat at the table and end up having a voice.
Well, they do that for themselves by being super fishy people that sit down at a device and try to, solve problems. I needed to do this, and I'm not finding anything else that does that well. We're just lucky to have them come to us to produce their flies.
Well, I want to ask you, because this is a question that comes up quite a bit. What makes a pattern or a design unique enough these days to be considered new? And I'll put it in this context. Like, back in the day, there was the Prince nymph, right? Everyone knew the Prince nymph, and it'd been around forever, right? I can't even think of who invented the Prince, but then all of a sudden it's the beadhead Prince, or it's the flashback Prince, or it's the fly formerly known as Prince. And to what degree do you have to tweak a fly or change a traditional long-established recipe for a pattern to be considered new and kind of unique enough to be a completely different pattern? Does that make sense?
Well, the Prince nymph was Doug Prince, who fished Northern California a bunch on the Kings River in 50s, 40s. Was that when that one kind of came around? But if it's a pattern, if it's a successful pattern, we'll have variations of it. So the Copper John's a good one. We had the Jumbo John, right? We had the jigged Copper John, like stuff that we feel like we can do to kind of open up that and that fly. But on the new side of it, we're looking for flies that go beyond, right? Like we have a fly committee that sits and votes on submissions, and it's a good diverse group. Alec used to sit on it when he was with UMPQUA, and you take a lot of factors in. Like, does it solve a particular problem? Does it go beyond what flies were created before it? Does it ride higher? Does it sink faster? Does it swim better? Does it, whatever the quality is that fly should do? And then we have to ask, will it sell? Like, you can have everyone writes a little note, this is my fly, and here's how I fish it, and man, it catches a lot of fish. And you look at some of them, you're like, I believe this thing would slay fish. And you're like, it has zero bin appeal. So it's got to get picked up at the fly bin as well. And so it's a delicate balance. It's a risk we take every year. We bring on a lot of new patterns each year. And of those, we don't know which are going to be the winners. So you make this big investment in bringing a pattern to market, and it may fall on its face for a number of reasons, right? Maybe that hatch was blown out that year, right? So it never really had a chance to even get sold. Or it had no bin appeal. No one picked it up, right?
Yeah, because it has to catch fish, but it also has to catch fishermen in the shops and in the bins, which is, a whole different factor, right?
It's a whole different factor. Yeah, it's a bit of a loaded question. It's tough to say exactly what a new pattern is. There are some patterns that, we have minimums for how many dozen is kind of the cutoff for an UMPQUA fly. And sometimes you talk to someone and, you're like, there's no doubt that this will sell that cutoff line. And you look at some flies and you're like, we're gonna introduce this to close it out, essentially. So it's a fine line and really trying to, as a committee, right, everyone's different perspective. Well, doesn't that look a lot like? And then you bring it up in our online catalog and you look at it, you're like, I don't think we can bring that in. Like, that's not even a variation of that. That's pretty much the same thing. They changed the wire on it. Sweet. Like, yeah. And, and when we send rejection letters or acceptance letters, we try to be really respectful. I'm like, hey, it looks a lot like this. Maybe if you continue to tweak it and resubmit it to us. And we really try to provide a little bit of feedback to them. So it's not just like, thanks, but no thanks.
I think it's so fascinating, the review committee, how all this works. Again, as we talked about at the beginning of the show, people come into a fly shop, they see loaded bins everywhere. They don't realize how much takes place behind the scenes and in the lead up to the manufacturing and distribution and kind of introduction phase for every one of these patterns. There's so much that goes into it.
It's unbelievable. When I first started working there, I've got, I call it the Men in Black story at this point. I had just started working there. I sat in my first production meeting ever. And these meetings, we go over material issues and fly lists, and you're looking at the year ahead and like, oh, this one's going to be a challenge delivery. What are some of the things we can do to make this happen? Because we've got, hundreds of dozens of these booked. Like, how do we figure it out? This year we were having issues with partridge. And so it was like, you're playing triage on what partridge flies you can tie. There was a bird flu, global shortage of partridge. And you're like, okay, let's get started. And I'm sitting there and I'm like 2 weeks in, I was like, I feel like I've made the worst decision of my life. Like, this is insane. This isn't going to last. We're going to go out of business. And my eyes are like saucers, and meeting ends. And Jeff's like, and we covered like 6 other material issues that day.
And Jeff's your CEO.
Yeah, Jeff's the president. And he brings me aside. He's like, you all right, bud? And I was like, yeah. Like, are we okay? And he was like, oh, man, buddy, this is nothing. We'll do this again next week. And I was like, oh, my goodness. He was like, I think we're like the Men in Black. There's like an alien invasion that's coming down, and no one needs to know about it. And I was like, well, hit me with the flashy thing, man. Like, this is crazy.
Reset right here. There we go.
So it's not an easy process. And even like the process of going out on the road and selling the flies for our reps. And we took last year to completely revamp the way we introduce new flies. And so traditionally, we would go out on the road and show you a pattern that was probably tied by the tire. And we say, hey, this is what it's going to look like. How many of these do you want? And, the dealers say like, well, that looks awesome. I'll take X amount of dozen. We take the next 6 months to tie all those flies and deliver them. And maybe they don't look the same, maybe whatever, right? We'd run into material issues. We don't deliver them, which had been the case for a lot of new flies, which again, sets that course back for success significantly. And so this year we decided we took last year as this we had the smallest offering UMPQUA's probably had since the early days in the 70s. So now everything we have, the samples that our reps go on the road with are tied by the tires, and they're available then. So we've solved all material issues. We give, from the marketing side, the game has changed so much. You want to be able to give people a fly that they can promote today. Just in. Not
6 or 8 months from now, but this can be in the bins right now.
Yeah, I was excited about it then.
Yeah.
Well, 6 months later, will I be excited about this in 6 months? Like, I'm excited about it today. Let's do something with it today. Boom. So we're trying to just continue to modernize the business and the way we introduce flies. So it's cool, and we really try to show off the flies. We really try to highlight the tires and any unique kind of properties with the fly, which is cool.
Well, we talked a little bit about the manufacturing process, how much goes into it, the steps involved in creating a great fly. Let me ask you for a minute about cost. Okay, both, there's the fly shop cost of the dealers and what they're seeing on their pricing for wholesale, but also the end user, the consumer, the angler cost. So I can run down to a hardware store here in Montana, or a general outdoor store, or heck, pretty much any gas station in the state, right? And they're going to have a little selection of flies hanging on the wall or in some little kind of dusty bin over in the corner. They're going to be a lot cheaper than an UMPQUA fly or a fly in a specialty shop. Why the cost difference? What makes UMPQUA flies and other premium fly brands worth the additional cost versus a gas station bought fly on, the edge of the road here in Montana?
Yeah, great question. This is, I'll go back to my bulk granola. You could look at the bin and they all look like bulk granola. You're like, that's granola. And like, well, this one's organic, right? Like, well, I don't know what that means. There's a lot of stuff that goes behind the scenes into that organic listing, right? And an UMPQUA fly is no different on that front, in my opinion. Because of the signature tires, they're our ultimate check of QC. They put their name on it. They don't want anything that's less than what they would do, correct? And so we tie to their specs. We pay living wages at our factories. We do all of the things that we believe are the right things to do without being asked to do them. And that has a cost to it. So it's everything from even taking an extra step to glue down the dumbbell eyes on a fly so that your head never twists with an UMPQUA fly. because we want you to be able to use that one for multiple fish, multiple trips, whatever that may be. We also don't want to get a call from a tyer every time they see their fly and say, this thing looks terrible. So we go through each step. We use high quality materials. We use TMCO hooks on most of our flies. Like, all of that adds to the cost of it. I think at the end of the day, what you get from UMPQUA is an unbelievable value at the price, but we're not afraid to say we're expensive because of all of those great things we put into that fly. And at the end of the day, right, you're standing on the pointy end of a boat. This could be your shot of the trip. You don't want to sacrifice the hook. You don't want to sacrifice the way the fly keels. And those are all the little details that we worry about, so that when you make the cast and it's the right cast, and you've set the hook and it's a good hook set, everything goes the way it should.
I think there's probably nothing else in a fly shop's lineup of product that's an example of you get what you pay for, right? If you want to buy super cheap flies, well, they might be okay when they're in the box. Just don't get them wet, right? Don't let them touch water because they're going to fall apart. And that's huge. You do not, and you just nailed it right there. You do not want to have the $2 or $3 or $6 item be the one thing that blows your chance at a memorable fish or successful on-water experience. And it truly is, you get what you pay for with flies.
Yeah, and we're it's been what we've hung our hat on literally since day one, is quality, and we're not changing that, and we're not running away from it. We're leaning into it harder more than anything, and it's easy to see if you tie flies, my opinion. If you're a general consumer, it can be a lot harder to see because they all have a hook, they have some feathers on them or whatever. I don't know the difference. You know the difference after fish 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And if you're a traveling angler, right, they're ready to go on the next trip, right? All that stuff.
And you talk about TMCO hooks. Now, one of the things we run into a lot, especially in destination angling, saltwater specifically, or jungle situations specifically, you can show up with a fly that looks good. It's the right profile. It's the right colors, probably a lot of the right materials. You show it to the guides and they're like, yeah, this is the wrong hook. It's not going to work. And having a quality hook, especially when you're out chasing big animals in far off places, right? There is nothing more important for that being a successful pattern. Talk to us a little bit about TMCO, why TMCO, what sets that apart and makes it the kind of quality hook that's going to work in these different demanding situations.
Yeah, that was another fascinating conversation I had with all these guys, was the intro of TMCO back in the day. And so this would have been in the mid-'80s. Ken Shimasaki was looking to make a Yamame hook, and he had a very specific need. TMCO is a much larger organization. They're not just a hook company that we know them. They sell everything from like wader bibs and boots and all that stuff. They're big over in Asia.
Yeah, fully integrated on all levels. Yeah,
correct. And he wanted this Yamame hook. They were a Partridge vendor, and Partridge said, "Oh, it's simply not possible to make the hook you want." And he was
we need to tell some of our listeners, Yamame are a fish that is native to Japan. They're like a tiny, beautiful jewel of a trout species. I think it's actually a cherry salmon derivative. I'm not sure, but they are incredibly difficult to catch. Probably one of the more challenging fish, and because they're small and they live in these incredibly pristine, ultra clear waters, they're very selective. You can't get by with throwing junk at these things. They are tough. Correct.
And so they told him no, and being the mind that he is, he said, "Well, cool, I'll do it myself." And so in Japan, they're known for high quality steel, high quality kind of everything. And so he started designing these hooks and shaping these hooks, and TMCO's little tagline is "Think in hand." So he literally does it all by hand too. So it's all bending the hooks and making the shapes by hand, and then he takes that into a machining process. And the Japanese steel for the diameter of wire is the finest there is. And any other hook brand that comes out of Japan, I would say, is of that same level of quality. What TMCO is unique about is the number of shapes that really make them what they are, right? And so you get the high quality steel, and you get really great trout fishing shapes. And that's what Ken really brought to the table and all that stuff. And so it's everything from great dry fly hooks to really big, nasty, big game hooks. And they don't fail. They don't have issues. Our quality, our reject on that is extremely low. And they're in high demand as a result of it.
And that gets back to the sporting goods store, the hardware store, the gas station. The hook quality is going to be radically different than what you're getting with a high quality premium fly.
Yeah, and I mean we sell our U series hooks, and U series hooks are non-Japan. We sell a 50 pack for less than you can get 25 TMCO hooks for. There's a reason for that.
It's price point.
Yeah. Yes, and which is great. It's not what I would put on my the end of my line if I'm going for a fish of a lifetime.
Well, I want to ask you briefly about the role that specialty fly shops play when it comes to fly selection and availability. Now, these days, obviously, flies can be found and ordered on multiple websites and e-com platforms. Some companies, have a direct-to-consumer now platform. It's getting a lot easier and quicker for people to buy flies. But, all that being said, there's something about walking into a fly shop, a specialty fly retailer, and you're greeted with aisles and aisles of fly bins that are stuffed with patterns for every conceivable fishing situation, different destinations, different species. How would you describe the role of the specialty fly shop today when it comes to selling and effectively marketing flies?
Yeah, it's a great question. We live off the backs of the specialty retailer. We're a non-direct-to-consumer brand. So we without the specialty retailer, we have no air in our lungs. They're incredibly important to us. And the selection that fly shops have, I think it's the most exciting part of a fly shop. They're called fly shops for a reason. We at UMPQUA certainly believe that. It's a confidence category at the end of the day. You walk in there and you want someone to walk you through the process and say what's fishing, what's working, and a sales associate comes through and walks you through the bins and kind of helps lead you through that. And, and you get every different level of angler in there. You get people that will take that advice and say, I like a little bit this or that, right? You get people that don't want any help and will browse the bins themselves and
they
pick
know
through
what they
it.
want. Yeah.
And then you get people that say, give the confidence to me. What are the right flies? And you can help them have their best day. I think the as easy as it is becoming to sell flies online, I still believe there's nothing like having someone walk through the flies with you and talk through the differences and the why and how to do it. I don't think that's ever going to go away for our little industry.
I love your line. They call them fly shops for a reason. That's perfect.
We do a lot of volume in flies.
I bet. Well, we've talked a ton about UMPQUA's business with premium flies. But that's certainly these days, 52 years after the company was founded, that is not all that you guys do. As crucial as is to your business, it's maybe 55, 60%. Talk to us about the other categories that you guys are playing in, other products that you offer through UMPQUA, and some of the other key pieces of gear and equipment.
Yeah, the fly has been at the center of our world since we got started, and it's offered kind of branches off into other categories for us where appropriate, right? We're not a rod company, but we are a leader and tippet company, right? We've been a leader and tippet company since the 80s. We're a hook company. We've been TMCO's exclusive distributor since 1985, I believe. And then we've developed our own line of hooks. We moved into fly storage because we felt that was appropriate for us. Stream set accessories that go onto our packs and bags that we offer. So we've kind of, if it has a direct relationship to the fly, if we feel like it's a category we've kind of entered into slowly over time. And yeah, that's grown into a real business for us. Like I said, leader tippet, pack bag, fly storage, stream side accessories, floatants, all of that is really kind of critical to kind of getting that best presentation, as we say.
Well, obviously, I always like on this program to bring things back to destination angling and travel, because that's a big part of why our listeners follow the Waypoints podcast. But specific to leader and tippet, of which you guys are a major player in the industry, You have some new products that are out that I feel, having used this stuff myself, that have some very specific applications for the traveling angler. And a good example is the new pink fluorocarbon that UMPQUA has introduced recently, and specifically its applications in saltwater. I mean, this could potentially be a game changer.
Totally. And it's not just saltwater. Any shallow water environment, the pink shines. And so if you take the visible light spectrum, the Roy G. Biv, and you just take that underwater, it starts to fall off in those appropriate color wavelengths. And pink's the lightest shade of red. So it falls out the quickest. And there really, when you start to look at it, there aren't any disadvantages to the pink. I only see the advantages of it. And because of the additive, it softens up the fluorocarbon a little bit, so knots come together a little bit easier. And then when we say like disappears, it just kind of grays out, right? It doesn't like vanish better than fluorocarbon, but it falls back into the environment a little bit easier. But we get to see it extremely well. So, that last bit of our leader is really our presentation portion. And so after 3 fly changes, your presentation portion may only be half of what it was. And in an all clear world, it's easy to kind of get lazy and be like, I think it's good. It's not too close. But when you can see how much you've chewed up of it, you're like, dude, I need to change this thing. The other thing is when you're fishing against structure because of that pink additive, in a traditional clear leader, any nicks in that would kind of glow like edge bright. That pink additive just knocks it all back, adding to the invisibility of it. So it's a cool product. We've got that from 8 pound all the way up to 80 pound. And so, I've heard from everything from triggerfish on it to catfish. It's been kind of crazy.
Well, having had the chance to use it myself, I will tell you, I'll give a huge shout out to that product because I feel like it's a game changer. I've experienced it myself, flats fishing, permit fishing. I'll take every advantage I can get, and this clearly seems to be a new advantage. So pretty exciting product, the pink fluorocarbon from UMPQUA.
Yeah, we're really excited to be able to introduce stuff like that.
Well, with our traveling anglers, a lot of exotic places, off the grid fisheries, flies, leader and tippet. How can travelers be sure, and let's talk specifically about flies again in this context, how can destination anglers be sure that UMPQUA is offering patterns that legitimately work in these destinations? Talk to us a little bit about your field testing, kind of the homework that goes into this. A lot of it, of course, is linked to the signature tires that may be from these areas, working in these fisheries. But there's a lot to be said for having confidence in the products you're buying and then taking to these far off places.
Yeah, being the largest fly company, our flies get fished a lot of places, and we get a lot of feedback. Sometimes good, extremely good, and sometimes like whoa, this or this happened, and we're very critical of ourselves. We want to continue to be known as the best, and so we take that feedback, and we try to make that and continue to evolve that into some of the best products we can have out there. And our signature tires are huge for that. And, we spoke about this the other day, but just being able to send our flies to those destinations and, hey man, you guys really think about X, Y, or Z. I don't know if you've considered that, small evolutions to patterns and stuff like that to continue to modernize them. That's what we're really interested in doing day in, day out here.
It's what keeps you in the game when you're talking about new and different fisheries, for sure.
Yeah, and it keeps our anglers in the game. I think that's the biggest part.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me ask you this. What's next for UMPQUA? It's been an incredible 50-plus years. What do the next 10 years look like? Are we getting to the point where, have we pretty much discovered everything there is with regards to fly design and innovative materials? Or is there, just new stuff coming down the pike every day? What are we thinking on that?
Man, we talk about that all the time. Like, what's next? Yeah. I don't think anyone ever thought that Patagons would be a big deal in Western fly bins, but they've kind of taken over. And we talk about that all the time. What's next in the fly world? And we sit there and try to think of it, and then we get a submission, and we're like, "Oh my gosh, this thing is crazy. Maybe this is what's next." And so, on a lot of the fly side, a lot of that's driven by local tires and continuing to solve that mousetrap on a daily basis. And they come up with crazy stuff. Some of it maybe is ahead of its time, and then we re-release it. But our little slogan's been kind of a legacy of innovation, and we've done everything from introduce, beads on flies. CDC was brought to the market by UMPQUA. High quality hooks. The first competitive, jigged barbless hooks were brought to the market by UMPQUA. Like, the next big thing is right around the corner. And we just have our headlights on driving down the road, and we're going to bump right into it.
Can we look forward to like the next generation of AI inspired fly designs?
Oh man, I hope not. I hope we don't go there.
Right. Well, Russ, this has been great. I can't tell how informative and interesting this has been. It's been great to sit down with you. Thank you so much for being here and joining us on Waypoints today.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for listening.
Well, that's it for the latest episode of Waypoints, the podcast that is 100% dedicated to travel and the search for adventure. Be sure to visit yellowdogflyfishing.com to plan and research your next fishing trip, source gear, equipment, and flies for your next destination, and stay up to date on the latest travel news and developments. Join us for our next episode of Waypoints, and remember, life is short and no one ever regretted a life of adventure.
This has been another episode of Waypoints, the podcast of fly fishing travel and adventure angling. Waypoints is produced by Brian Gregson with music provided by the Steep Canyon Rangers. Visit yellowdogflyfishing.com for more destination profiles, travel news, and expert advice, and be sure to join us for our next episode.